All right, we're going to finish up this chapter. I don't think it'll take more than about 20 minutes, but this is so important, all of this information. I don't want to short you on it. I already feel like I already have from, as I've said before, there's a lot more examples I could give you that are fascinating, et cetera, et cetera. But, it is what it is when we do this online. So we were talking about family as a major agent of socialization. Then we finished up with grandparents. So now what we're looking at is play, peer groups, and friends. Play is really important, and it has certain functions that are identified with it and why it is important. So the first function is that it enhances cognitive development. So if you think about doing puzzles, for instance, adults still love to do puzzles, many of them, because there's a wonderful brain uh, uh, function that happens when you're doing puzzles. But for little children, things like blocks and puzzles and Lincoln logs that we used to have and a variety of other things. I worry about the screen time, and we're going to get into that in a little bit here. So I'm not including those, but I know that that's what kids play with a lot now. So books, even that kind of play. I mean, and there are interactive books and things of that nature. Unfortunately, they're kind of very gender typed from a very, very early age. But, and when you think about what kind of toys, we talked about the toy aisle. Uh, and then this was a shocking statistic to me. 92% of American girls 3 to 12 own at least one Barbie. Now, luckily, Barbie has uh, added many different, and since 2016, it's added different body types, skin color, hair type, hairstyles, and hairdos to the standard, Barbie. Um, and that was because their sales plummeted due to other kinds of dolls that were competitive. There was competition for them. But yeah, I had no idea that 92% of American girls 3 to 12 owned a Barbie, but apparently that's true. So girls play with dolls, boys play with trucks, ad infinitum stereotypically. If you can mix that up a bit, if you're a parent, that would be very, very, very nice if you could do that. My son had the first anatomically correct male baby doll, and I think maybe the only one now. He's off the market. His name was Timmy. He was so cute. And because he had had sisters, I had things like doll high chairs and a cradle. And although he also had a toy plastic chainsaw, because we live in the woods, his dad had a chainsaw, um, and he saw chainsawing a lot. He also had Timmy. He didn't play with Timmy a lot, but Timmy was there, and Timmy, so he grew up to be one of the kindest adult males I have ever known in my life. He's wonderful with animals and children and that type of thing. I'm not saying it's all because he had a male doll when he was a baby, but I don't think it hurt actually. So, and I, for example, was so lucky. My grandparents had friends who had two much older sons, and they gave me all of their erector sets and very good and expensive blocks and that type of thing. So I had a lot of dolls and I loved them and I loved dressing them up and making clothes when I got older for them and all that. But I also had some of those things that develop spatial awareness with girls and ability. So, and that was just luck for me in that situation. So think about that when you're raising children. And Head Start now and other more enlightened preschools always have toys that both males and females can play with that are not gender specific. They're that cross gender our stereotypical idea of what boys and girls should play with. So the other thing that play does, so it enhances cognitive development, it enhances social development, and especially when that kind of play is structured into hobbies and sports and that type of thing. It also strengthens peer relationships. If you're playing, you're often sometimes you're playing alone, as some of those examples I gave you, but you're often playing with others. Um, so play is a powerful socializer. Peers and friends, as I'm sure you know, are also very, very powerful socializers. And peer influence increases dramatically as children get older, and then especially in the teen years. And peers serve as role models uh, for good or ill. It kind of depends on who you're hanging out with, right? So in 7th to 12th graders, if you're hanging out with a friend who's doing bad stuff, it really increases the likelihood that you will too. The same thing in college. If you're hanging out with low achievers and people who don't take school, this is all based on research. I'm not just saying this. And the research is cited in your text. But it's the same thing in college. If you're hanging out with people that are blowing it off, you tend to do that as well. I'm going to say this, you may tend to do that as well. But that's powerful socialization as our peers. Teachers and schools are really powerful socializers. Um, Teachers don't just teach knowledge, nor do schools, as we talked about last week. Um, but there's that latent functions of schools and teachers. But one of the beautiful things that schools and teachers do is help you learn to think about the world in a different way. For instance, we just talked about more modern times gender. There's gender. We aren't being so gender specific about toys. Well, it's the same with things like multiculturalism that is being taught in schools, right? And you're going to learn in sociology, anthropology, uh, those two courses in particular always have chapters on race and ethnicity and things of that nature that you'll get exposed to. So yeah, they're very powerful ways of socializing. Also, schools often have take the roles that parents used to have, serve some of the functions that parents used to have, sex ed, drug and alcohol, assemblies about drugs and alcohol, suicide, that type of thing. And teachers' impact on children's development are as among the most important socialization agents. How many stories have you heard from people who they talk about Oprah Winfrey talking about her fourth grade teacher in the textbook who spotted her talent and her ability and her intelligence. I had a teacher like that who was just, I'll never forget her in grammar school. And I think it was about the same age. I think it was fourth grade, who let me do my thing, and really encouraged me in doing it. So that's, you know, you're extremely lucky if you've had that experience with a teacher. And it isn't just in elementary school. Often in college, teachers become mentors to students and that type of thing. So, what about popular culture and the media? Well, this gets into the stuff that I can barely talk about it. It is so disturbing. As I reread the text and wrote this lecture, I was thinking, it really is just such a completely different world. What a Pandora's box was opened with the internet and with social media. I love the internet. I do tons of research on the internet. I look up things all the time on the internet. But I know what I'm looking for, and I know what sources to go to. And I don't do social media at all. I can't even imagine, participating in that and being the product, as we know that if you're not paying for something, you're the product, right? So here's where we're at with electronic media. Now, if adults want to choose to do this stuff, great. But the fact that little children's brains are getting wired to the extent that they are in some very negative ways is pretty disturbing to me, both from my experience as an early childhood teacher and certainly in my later life of these many decades of teaching at the college level. So here's what the deal is. The American Society of Pediatrics has said for years that little ones should avoid media other than video chat, possibly for children who are younger than 18 months old. Now, I noticed that this text, now it's 18 months. They've dropped that down to 18 months for any kind of screen time from 24 months, which is what it used to be. No screen time before 24 months, okay, before 2 years. The American Society of Pediatrics said that. Now they've dropped it down to 18 months, okay. So from the ages from 2 to 5, screen time should be limited to 1 hour per day. And with that, only high quality programs. Okay. You know, they're also talking about television here, just so you know that. So your 1 hour a day, maybe Sesame Street, you know. But despite all of those recommendations by the American Society of Pediatrics and others, 97% of children under 4, regardless of family income, use mobile devices like smartphones and tablets. Children under 4, that's kind of, to me, very mind-blowing. So here's when use it the most, when parents see they're just babysitting distraction devices, even though they're doing harm to children. Okay, so what parents say when kids use them the most, when they're doing busy doing chores, parents, that 70% of the parents say that that's when the kids are on them for long periods of time. Keeping the kids calm in public, 65% of parents say they do that with them. Running errands, when parents are running errands, the kids are on their devices, 58% of parents say that's when they are. And then this is the one that boggles the mind, and that's putting children to sleep. Screens do not put children or humans to sleep. They do just the opposite, really, in terms of what's going on with your brain and brain functions when you're watching screens. So average kids spend more time than in school on devices. A typical 8 to 10-year-old, nearly 8 hours per day on some type of electronic media. 13 to 18-year-olds, nearly 9 hours. I often wonder, okay, what do you have time to do anything to actually make anything, to explore any new pathways that you might want to explore in life, to create art or music, that type of thing. Okay, sorry, it obviously drives me nuts. Okay, so you know what is linked to this behavior of being on screens 8 and 9 hours a day? Once again, the research is cited in your text, and there's plenty more of it. You can look online. It's linked with violence, cyberbullying, trouble in school, obesity, lack of sleep, and lower grades. What is going on here is that it's what's called passive consumption. Okay? You're watching and listening, you're not creating, there's no mastery involved. You're not building up an account of things you can do that you can fall back on in life, because you're being a passive receiver for all of this stuff. Okay, and then they get into violent video games, which can encourage. It doesn't for all males. It's predominantly males who are consumers of violent video games. I'm sure you're very aware of that. They've done everything they can do to figure out how to market it to females And not that there aren't some women who do violent video games, but it's infinitesimal compared to the male consumption of them. It can, among some males, encourage antisocial behavior and male to female aggression. There's a box on page 74 that also addresses some of this. What about advertising? Advertising's a major, major socializer, okay? Unhealthy food, body image issues. We could also think about Instagram in there and what it's doing for young women and suicidal thoughts and body image stuff. It's nuts. So that's advertising. Okay, socialization throughout the life. Now we're running up to the end of this chapter now, so we're going to go through each stage in life and talk about it with socialization. So, although infancy and childhood is a very small fraction of your or anyone's life, it's probably the most crucially important part of your life. Because infant brains, as your textbook puts it, are small computers. So, the quality, you know what they say about computers and data, garbage in, garbage out. Okay, if your infant has got a computer for a brain, I mean, it's basically small computers. It's just going. I mean, the stimuli that's coming in is nuts. And so what goes in needs to be well thought out, very high quality, that type. Thoughtful. Maybe that's just the word that should be used. It needs to be thoughtful. How you interact with infants, what you provide them with, that type of thing. So the quality with parents and caregivers has a huge effect on the development of infants and infant brain development. So talking to babies and young children increases their vocabulary. By age 2, toddlers who know more words have better language skills can help control their behavior, their own behavior better. Okay. And, you know, it just, I can still often remember people saying both, once again, when I was in Head Start and when I teach this stuff at college, why would you read to an infant who can't even, understand what you're saying? Because, my gosh, you got them sitting on your lap, so you got the warm fuzzies going right. You have pictures, because pictures for very young children, books for young children are picture books. Pictures, you're turning pages and you're reading, they're hearing your voice, they're hearing language, they're picking up words. It's just so important to do that. So we used to read to young children, very young children, a lot more than people do today because, once again, there's social media. Children through adolescence, 4 to 12, okay, at that point they're acquiring more cognitive skills, processing thoughts, talking, reasoning. They can memorize things at that point, and recall information, analyzing problems. So the quality and quantity of time spent on developing cognitive abilities by teachers and by parents have very, very, very long-term outcomes, lifetime, long-term outcomes. Now, unfortunately, social class enhances or limits cognitive growth, regardless of race or ethnicity. So, middle-class families tend to do what's called concerted cultivation. They are deliberately improving their children's cognitive abilities and social skills through reading, through experiences, going to zoos, going to museums and art galleries and theater and music, all that type of thing. Concerted cultivation. Okay, so you read to children, you help them with they're helping them with their homework. Parents attending school functions is very important to children. They're also more likely to enroll their children, middle class parents, in extracurricular activities, which is very important. Working class families, because they're working so much and so hard, they have much less free time, many fewer resources generally than middle class and upper middle class parents, are involved in what's called natural growth. That is as opposed to concerted cultivation. Sounds like gardening. Well, you kind of are gardening when you have babies. You're growing something. So what working class families have is what's called natural growth, and that is that the kids have a lot more autonomy in everyday life, and they don't have that direct nearly as much. And this is not every working class family and every middle class family. You understand this. We're talking about statistically relevant percentages that are different in each group. So the gap between the two of the working class children's experience and cognitive development and that of working class parents and families, it's grown dramatically since the 1990s. In a study of 7 to 10-year-olds, also, this whole idea now that every child gets an award for everything kind of thing, it has some real downsides to it. What they've studied here with 7 to 10-year-olds is that if you're constantly praising a kid and bolstering self-esteem, and every little tiny achievement gets a big deal, is, oh, isn't that wonderful? What it leads to is narcissism. Okay? And kids who are raised that way often can't handle any kind of setbacks. They don't have much ego strength, because narcissism's the opposite of ego strength. Narcissistic people are people who really aren't sure they're completely okay, so they overcompensate by thinking they're the greatest. So it leads to narcissism. Kids who can't tolerate setbacks, they tend to be more violent and at higher risk for addiction and depression. So, but what studies do show consistently over and over again is that well-deserved praise strengthens the parent-child relationship and problem-solving skills for children, and also for their self-image and for their own ego strength. Okay, so be sure and praise your child when they do something that really deserves praise, but don't constantly praise every little thing, okay, according to the research. Okay? Also, there's some very sad statistics here. More than 5 million children younger than 18, that's 7% of all children in the age group, have an incarcerated parent. Okay, they're not getting the cultivated, the concerted cultivation, right? Those kids. So that is how many again? 5 million children younger than 18, which is 7% of all children in the United States, have an incarcerated parent. 460,000 are in foster care. 13% of children in America live in households where a parent or other adult uses, manufactures, or sells drugs. And every year, at least 684,000 children suffer neglect, abuse, either physical or sexual abuse and violence. So childhood is, it can be an iffy time. It kind of all depends on what your personal situation is. Which depends, by the way, to go back to sociology, on structural issues. What's going on in the economy? Is there universal preschool? We know that kids who go to Head Start do so much better in school and in later life than kids who don't, because they're ready for kindergarten when they go. So, all of those things, many of the things you're hearing debated and talked about right now, have powerful effects on children and what their socialization, their outcome, for, and what it will mean for their adult lives. Okay, teenage years, 13 through 19. This, as we know, is a period of huge change, establishing your own identity, becoming more independent. Uh, those of us who've raised teenagers know that it can be, or in the process, some of you maybe, that it can be difficult, lots of changing moods and behaviors. But now we know that it's not necessarily raging hormones that are causing those uh, things that we see happening that are difficult to deal with sometimes, that are problematic, but really it's radical changes that are going on in the brain. So what's happening is the brain changes at different rates in adolescence. So the areas dealing with processing information and controlling physical movement mature first. Think about this: processing information and controlling physical movement. That's what is developing first in these adolescent years. And the parts of the brain for controlling impulses, for avoiding risky behavior, for planning ahead, all of which are hallmarks of adult behavior, are the last to mature. So that explains what some of the issues are. Once you know that as a parent, you can kind of adjust what your expectations are and what you need, how to help, right? Helicopter parents, I'm sure we've all heard that term. Hovering, managing everything, making too many, what that does, they're hyper involved, intrusive, over controlling. It's not helpful. Back off, right? As teachers, we've all, to one degree or another, experienced this, much less at the college level. But I have a few times. I've gotten a few phone calls or emails. And man, they really get mad when you can't tell them grades or things like that. You can't. FERPA prevents us from telling anybody that in high school. In college. So what this does, this helicopter parenting, is it diminishes the kids' ability to develop decision-making and problem-solving skills on their own. Okay, what about adulthood in terms of socialization? Well, you have to inhabit a lot of new roles in adulthood, often. Work, marriage, parenthood, divorce, remarriage, buying a house, death of parents, etc., etc. The empty nest is not so empty anymore. It used to be a characteristic of adulthood, later adulthood, that suddenly, after having kids in the house for 20 years, you're all alone. It's an empty nest. The house is empty. Well, that's not what's going on anymore, primarily due to economic issues. But it's called the crowded empty nest. So now young adults are at home much longer. Many of you are, about a third of young adults live at home still. It's called the boomerang children, boomerang generation. Leave, but move back in with the parents, sometimes with a spouse or a girlfriend or their children. Most young adults leave by the age of 23, but a large number of 18 to 34-year-olds are living with their parents, increased from 20% in 1960 to 32% in 2014. Men are more likely to live with their parents than women. The macro level factors are economics, as I just said: jobs, credit card debt, the housing market, et cetera, the outrageous amount of costs, and the hoops you have to jump through to even just rent an apartment today are insane. So that's macro level. Micro level, today, 33% of parents say that they don't expect their children to be self-sufficient economically until they're about 25. So if that expectation is there with parents, then that's part of the whole gestalt of it's okay for kids to come home. This is really something. 87% of 18 to 24-year-olds live at home. That's really amazing. Many are postponing marriage. Stigma's gone about living at home. There used to be a stigma if you were older and living at home. I left when I was 18 and I never came back. That And it wasn't because things were bad. It was because, man, I really wanted to get on with my life and be an adult and be self-sufficient. But that's, a generational thing, isn't it? And it's also an economic thing. I could go to New York City, get a job, a week after I was there, rent an apartment with two friends for, I think it was $75 a month. It must have been my share. Anyway, you could do it then, but it's very, very difficult today. So I didn't want you to think I was beating anybody up for living at home. I completely get it, completely. So what about work roles? That's major socialization. The average person born between 1957 and 1964 had 11 jobs. Uh, just really crazy. From the ages of 18 to 46 alone, they had 26% of them had 15 or more jobs. So each new job, there's new socialization that occurs. You have to learn the rules, both the written, spoken, manifest rules, and just the cultural rules of the situation. So that can be difficult. Learning work roles can be difficult and stressful. Um, and as I said, there's also the subtle rules. Being laid off also can be very, very stressful and traumatic, particularly for midlife men ages 45 to 60. It can really be awful. You have to learn new job skills. Their pay declines by as much as 70%. It's really difficult. So, what about parenting roles? That's huge too, that happens. And that doesn't necessarily come naturally. We all think it will, but those of you who've experienced having a baby, especially the first time, and the whole upheaval of your sleeping patterns and all kinds of other things, your social life, all of it. So first time parents kind of muddle through, and they often don't realize also how expensive children are. They're incredibly expensive. Middle income couples, average of about 81,000 a year. I wanted you to notice that. Middle income is how this is defined. It's actually upper middle income. They don't say that. Is $81,000, $81,700 a year. So that's almost $82,000 a year. They spend about 16% of their earnings on their child during the first 2 years. You can figure out how much that is. And we'll spend almost $234,000 for each child from birth through high school. The minimum people spend is about $100,000 birth through high school. And then the costs are much higher for single parents and low income families, especially if a child is disabled or chronically ill. So there's also what's called the sandwich generation. There are people who, this is a whole new socialization. You have your family and your kids and you're barely getting by, and then one of the adult parents, one of the grandparents, comes to live with you. So you're caring for an elder and young children in your house. That's called the sandwich generation. Um, then in later life, we have a lot of new roles to learn. Uh, you know, because we all live so much longer now, you might spend 20% of your life in retirement. So you've lost your role as a worker, whatever your profession or your job was. Your health, you may have health problems, sometimes poverty. Although the elderly, because of Social Security, are not the poorest people in America. It's actually children who are the poorest in America, who live in poor families. What about resocialization and total institutions? Resocialization means you've got to, well, it's just what it says. Unlearning old ways of doing things and learning new ways that are adopting new attitudes, values, norms, and behaviors. So it can be mild, could be intense, it can be involuntary or voluntary. So moving for a job to a different country, for instance, is voluntary, but man, you got to learn a whole new culture and be re-socialized. Entering a religious order is an example. That's voluntary, and you have to learn the rules. Going into a drug and treatment center would be another one of being resocialized. Serving in the military certainly is a whole resocialization process. But it's usually fairly mild, really. If you think about college students getting, socialized into being a college student, into living in dorms, if that's what you're doing, being a new employee is another resocialization. Some of it can be difficult or intense. Being a new parent, we just talked about that. Divorce. Now, you were a couple, now you're single, and it's a whole new way of being resocialized. Getting out of the military and the PTSD that so many military folks experience, coming back into uh, this world. If you've seen Hurt Locker, if you haven't, it's an amazing movie, and it really, his resocialization is it really demonstrates how difficult it can be for people who've been in a war zone to come back to a non-war zone. Uh, Also, it can be involuntary. Now, what is some examples of involuntary resocialization are children being sent to foster homes, older people being sent by their families to assisted living. Certainly, going to prison is involuntary. When we had the draft in America, being drafted was another situation where, man, were you so resocialized? So the last thing we're going to talk about now are total institutions. So the military is a total institution, prisons are total institutions. One can make an argument that convents and monasteries are total institutions. They are. I shouldn't say one can make an argument. They are. The argument I could make is that sometimes hospitals are, but they don't really fit. But what happens in a total institution is they're isolated, they're enclosed social systems in some way, and those social systems control most aspects of your life when you're in them, if not all. It depends on which ones they are. But one thing they have in common is something called the degradation ceremony. And the whole point of a degradation ceremony, think about this, whether it's a prison or the military, man, your hair comes off, uh, all your um, all your personal identification is taken away from you. Everybody's wearing the same uniform. Everybody has the same haircut. Everybody's doing the same things. That's called your personal identity kit that is removed from you. You can't call out. You can't talk to family. I don't. You said during basic training in the military for 6 weeks, you can't have contact. Whatever. These are all degradation ceremonies, and the whole point is to undo your sense of identity so that the institution can rebuild you into a person that rebuild a new identity, someone who follows orders, someone who, behaves a certain way. So that's what a total institution is. And if you think about it, even monasteries and ceremony and convents do the same thing to a great extent. There's hair cutting, uniforms, personal identity kit is gone, isolated from family and friends. And you can see why I said a hospital's kind of like that. I mean, talk about a degradation ceremony. Just getting into a hospital gown is a kind of a degrading ceremony. There's controlled hours when you can connect with people. You're expected to behave in a certain way, or you're, quote, non-compliant. So I don't mean to confuse you here. Hospitals are not technically total institutions, but I always kind of, I guess, joke that there's an element of that to them. So that's it on socialization. I'm sorry this was not 20 minutes. It was twice as long as I thought it would be, but it's just such an important subject, and it's so full of different theories and aspects and information. It's important to go over all of them.